Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 13th of April and today's video is going to be really interesting as we're looking at an area of the front line that we seldom cover, but the Russians recently have made some significant advances along this, I would say, 10-kilometer span of the front line. So that will be a major focus of today's upload, but we're also looking at more generally advances around Toretsk, an area that's seen a large uptick in intensity and Russian ground maneuvers. We're going to look at the reconquest of additional portions of Kursk over the past couple of days. And if I am able to squeeze it in by the end of the video, I will also discuss some resignations that recently occurred within Ukraine's defense ministry and some parallel agencies, and updates about the recruits, the 18 to 24-year-old volunteers, and the statistics about how many of them have actually signed contracts to join the armed forces of Ukraine, because the number is actually really surprising. And hopefully, the recording mechanism that I'm using for this video isn't too bad. I'm just in a bit of an awkward situation with my laptop right now. But let's get into the video. And as we zoom in, you're going to see that I'm starting off with the Velika Novosilka sector. I'm not really going to zoom in and out that much because my Wi-Fi right now is really bad. But let's begin by seeing over here that the Russian forces have captured what amounts to 4.4 square kilometers of territory just to the north of Vilnipola and west of Burlatske. This is based on, I believe, a geolocation that we have over here. Yeah, so the Sicario units, which is one of the most active units along this part of the front line recently, they've been shelling incessantly these Russian squads, and this is the latest example from April 10th. They were hiding in a tree line just to the southeast of Shevchenko. So now I have Russian soldiers that are already at the approaches of the largest village in this region. I suppose you could say that Komar rivals it in size, but when you compare the size of Shevchenko to some of the neighboring hamlets, it is rather large. And up until a couple of months ago, it was used as a sort of rear gathering station for the Ukrainian companies that then were deployed to the front line. But now the Russians are approaching it, and from there, it's the final village before reaching the trench line, the 30-kilometer wide trench line horizontally, of course, that divides the Komar area. It divides the Mokreli River. It extends westwards past Donetsk into Zaporozhye and the Dnipro. And of course, by virtue of taking over Shevchenko, the Russian forces would also reach the border between Donetsk and Dnipro near the village of Malivka. So that is something to keep in mind moving forward. But just one last thing about the Velika Novosilka sector. It appears that the 110th Mechanized Brigade has been moved elsewhere. It is no longer deployed to this region, and actually, at the very least, some of its elements have been moved to the Toretsk region. In 110th Brigade, even though they presided over a period of time in Velika Novosilka that was very unfavorable because they lost control over that village and they lost a really large quantity of just square kilometers of territory, but then also very smaller settlements. They were still the bedrock of Ukraine's defense in this region. They were involved in dragging out the fighting as long as possible, and the soldiers that actually were involved in the frontline combat, they tried as hard as they could and did lead to increased yield when it comes to Russian attrition rates. And so they are an experienced force, despite the numerous times that they've had their entire structure really destroyed due to engaging in really important work, acting as the vanguard while other forces withdrew back to the rear for safety. The same thing happened in Avdiivka, and it also occurred in Velika Novosilka at the beginning of the year. But now they're going to do something similar, I presume, in the Toretsk region. So this means that there's a deficit of around 2,000 men that are no longer deployed to the Velika Novosilka region, where the Russians are still advancing, which is an issue, of course, for them. They're going to have to try to work on a contingency plan without one of the best units that was deployed to that region. Zooming in on the Dnipro direction, the Russian forces have been able to acquire some additional territory. According to a deep state update, the Russians were able to capture this sliver of territory just to the west, or I should say east of Kotlyarivka. And this also acts as a maneuver by the Russians to isolate the remaining Ukrainian presence around Nadivka, which is really large. Despite the fact that the Russians have made significant inroads in the eastern portion of the village, there still is Ukrainian resistance in some agricultural areas and trenches in the northwest. Here we have a geolocation from April 11th of the 414th. I believe it's already by now Strike Regiment, previously named the Birds of Magyar units. So they conducted just a whole host of FPV strikes targeting a Russian column, and they destroyed a Russian tank in one of these videos. This was from April 11th. Based on that video, we have this here. nearly 1 square kilometer of territory taken over by the Russian side. And this also means that the Russians have further strengthened positions to fully take over the environs of Nadivka. From there, the question is, will the Russians continue with this same pace and same, I suppose, deployment of resources, and I'm specifically referring to armored columns, to attack northwards, to provide this sort of southern flank to attack towards an area like Novoserhivka, Novo-Oleksandrivka, and Novomykholaivka, so the Russians don't have to assault these villages head on directly like they did in Uspanivka, which, as we all know, is a really burdensome task. Now, to move on, I want to look, as I said before, at an area of the front line that hasn't been covered much recently, and this is an area to the east of Mirnorod. Basically, you have the Toretsk River over here, and it acts as a dividing line between the Russian and Ukrainian lines, respectively. So, really, it's just been the status quo that each side is on, I suppose, either the east or the western portion of the river, and there haven't been really a lot of efforts by either side to change that status quo because the attrition rates will be too high, and both sides have been focusing on other parts of the front line that are more closely connected to Pokrovsk or its flanks. But recently, we have this geolocation which indicated a Russian advance of 1 square kilometer north of the river, including north of the village of Novo Toretsk, and we have a geolocation to back it up. This is from the 14th National Guard Brigade, which is one of the main units involved in defense over here from the Ukrainian side. So they shelled a Russian column north of this village, and that's from April 12th. This also means that the Russians are trying to find a new means by which to take over Yelizavetivka, because initially they tried through the basically Vozvizenka, blossoming, which occurred. Let's see when it actually occurred. It occurred at like the beginning of the year, January 1st. That's when the 5th Motor Rifle Brigade started launching rather deep penetrations and attacks towards the highway that connects to Mirnorod and Pokrovsk, as we all know. And then from there, they tried to use those outstretched positions at salient to attack from the east towards Yelizavetivka. And they were able to enter in, but they were not able to retain those positions for an extended period of time. The Ukrainians were able to have the gumption to hold on and then push them out. So now it seems there's some sort of maneuver from the west in order to provide another flank and another vector of attack to finally squeeze out the Ukrainians from those positions. And more generally, this region, and I'll measure it over here, that is between Malinivka and the line of contact, it's about 3 to 4 kilometers. And it's largely open fields, not that many trenches. There were a couple of trenches and anti-tank ditches to the north, but they were more so focused on a eastwards attack from the east horizontally, not necessarily a south-north attack. And so this region is actually opportune for the Russians. Potentially, they could take over these large open fields, parts of this road over here, and then the heights as well. This entire region is located on a rather high elevation that overlooks the Kazeni Toretsk River and all of these population centers that are protecting the eastern flank of Mirnorod. But we just don't have indications that the Russians are building up a force for that sort of objective. Is just something that I've noticed that could be a possibility in the future, in a very similar fashion to what I've noted about the basically Kalynove front. I suppose that's what you should refer to it as, because there aren't any other, I suppose, better monikers. I suppose, like more generally, if you zoom out, you could call it the Konstantinivka direction, because the city of Konstantinivka is located to the north, and a lot of the Russian offensives right now, a lot of the urban battles that they're engaged in, they all sort of culminate around Konstantinivka when you look at the bigger picture. But for now, we're looking at areas that are much further southwards. And you can see that over the past couple of days, the Russians have taken over an extremely large swath of territory. Because just recall, for the past year, this part of the front line had been basically static. The Ukrainians did not have that many resources deployed over here, and neither did the Russians, despite the fact that they have a major logistics point located in Ocheretyne, only like 5 kilometers away from the front line. But nonetheless, they never really focused on attacking northwards, I suppose because it didn't have much tactical value, as all the other developments during the summer of 2024 were sort of headed in the direction of Pokrovsk and southwards. But now the situation in Pokrovsk is, of course, stabilized, and there are new opportunities due to the Russian gains in Toretsk. And so now the opportunity has presented itself for the Russian side to begin shifting their focus towards this location, which is, of course, sort of a building block and a sort of buffer zone that separates the Russian line of contact that is so large, or I suppose the Russian rear that is really powerful, and you have a large quantity of logistics nodes, command and control posts, equipment, staging points for vehicles and troops in Avdiivka, and then also to the south in Donetsk, and then from there to Ocheretyne. And a lot of the, I suppose, maximum potential of these nodes of a Russian organization, they're sort of stymied because they can't be maximized to their full potential as long as you have this large section of the front line, I suppose, spanning at most 20, 25 kilometers that separates the Russians from where they currently are to Konstantinivka, which is a major objective of the Russian side to try to reach this city, one of the largest cities that is in Donetsk, that is still under Ukrainian control, and acts as a, I suppose, road junction to separate various Ukrainian pieces of equipment and units towards other parts of the front line wherever they are needed. So now you're seeing the Russians begin to increase their tempo, and I forgot to edit the map over here to show the Ukrainians are no longer present in some of these areas, but in yellow you can see the Russian control. So they've taken over 5 square kilometers in the western parts of this front line, including areas that are very close to the village of Zelenopole. They've taken over almost all of Kalynove, actually. Certain portions of it are still in a gray zone or under Ukrainian control, but we do have footage. This is from the 242nd Motor Rifle Regiment, one of the main units involved in fighting over here. They released footage of their flag raising event within the southern portion of the village. And you could also see that this is the Storm Assault Detachment, which is just a subdivision, and it's sort of the vanguard of the units. So they were involved in the actual assault that overran parts of Kalynove. And you can see over here, let's click on this part of the map. So you could see this is an additional 5 square kilometers. So in total, it's over 10 square kilometers of territory in this very small region that previously, for the past year, had not seen any movement at all being taken over in a matter of days by the Russian side. And in terms of other units that may be involved in fighting over here, there are a couple of other possibilities. I suppose one of them may be the 1438th Territorial Motor Rifle Regiment. A lot of these newly formed units from, I suppose, the beginning of 2024 or late 2023, they're deployed to the rear end of Divka, and so maybe some of them have recently been redirected to fight a bit northwards and engage in the fighting towards Kalynove. They could be just seen as fillers for this part of the front line, but now it's actually beginning to see development. So the Ukrainian side, it includes the separate presidential brigade, but probably only one battalion of it, because it has like 5 prominent battalions that are all mechanized, by the way, and they're basically split up between various locations, and there's no continuity between them. There's no connection between those battalions on a day-to-day basis. One of them, for instance, could be around Velika Novosilka, and then another one around Luhansk. But the brigade headquarters apparently is located around here, and one of his battalions is located here. And the same thing with the 109th Territorial Defense Brigade. It's located in this region, but again, one of the lower caliber units. And again, the size, when you add it up together, is rather small. And so that's why it's such an opportune position for the Russians to end up attacking. And you could see there's also a drone unit over here, and let's see what this is. Just one battalion of another territorial defense brigade. So clearly not a sufficient amount of forces that the Ukrainians have deployed over here, because they took it for granted that the situation was stable. And now that it's changing, there's an issue, because there's still a lot of intensity on Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians would like to ensure that the front line over there remains stable. And then in Toretsk, they're actually moving in reinforcements from other parts of the front line to hold the current positions, and even that's not enough. So they can't really take positions. They can't really take forces away from Toretsk to move them to the southwest. So it's going to have to come from an area that's further away. At the same time, though, the Russian forces are pushing and putting pressure further westwards, and they've nearly taken over the entirety of this chain of villages that I've discussed numerous times, from Sukhabalka to Alexanderpil. It's an area that is heavily fortified, and the Ukrainian garrison over here, albeit it's small, but it was tight knit and succeeded in really pushing back whatever Russian frontal assaults occurred. But now that's changed. The Russian forces have been able to occupy coming in from the east, largely the 68th Tank Regiment. So there were some armored supports taking over Panteleon, Monivka, and Alexandropol. And now they've also reached the highway that leads to Konstantinivka. So that includes a 5 square kilometer advance over here, and then another one to the south of Alexandropol, another 3.7 square kilometers. What this means is that there's this very narrow salient where presumably there are still Ukrainian forces present because there are a couple of dugouts and trenches and basically just positions that they were so used to holding on to. So it's not that likely that they would abandon them so quickly. But now they are in a compromised situation because both from the west and from the east, they are losing ground. And so it's going to become apparent very soon to these Ukrainian squads, and they're very small in size, just, maybe a couple dozen that are operating in this region, that they will have to withdraw further northwards and potentially try to stabilize along this line over here because there is a trench line running along this paved road. But the question is whether they will be able to do so given the Russian momentum and given the lack of Ukrainian reinforcements, even though these areas are heavily fortified and the Ukrainians can take advantage of rugged terrain and having just in-depth knowledge of this region, coordination with drone crews against advancing Russian forces in open fields. All of that should be taken into account. But given the current momentum and pace, it's very unlikely that they would be able to stop it with this current force. And the Russians, once they see this sort of opportunity and see that there are continued advances, they may begin to pour in more resources into this area in order to maximize their, I suppose, tactical achievements over here, with all of it sort of culminating around Stara Mykolaievka to the north. And then from there, they could advance along the local roads to reach Zoria. And there are a couple of villages over here that are sort of connected just by road networks. And then all the hinterlands in between are open fields. And besides the areas that you see in yellow over here, the sort of the region that is, I suppose, to the west of Zoria and to the east of the T0504 highway, it's on rather high elevation and it lacks many of the obstacles and defenses that you see deployed near the front line. So this is an area that the Russians could also shift their focus to. It's not really an area that we're looking at right now with much of, I suppose, intent. We're not really intently looking at it, but it should be noted that this region from Yablunivka to the front line is on rather high elevation and overlooks the highway and all the trench systems built by the Ukrainians to defend that highway. So that could also become in the future, and I'm talking throughout the entirety of 2025, a vector through which the Russians put pressure onto Ukraine supply lines and onto rear cities. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And we will continue looking at this front in depth because I'm sort of bullish on the movement around here and the intensity of fighting. I believe that it will begin to increase as the Russians sense an opportunity over here. But right now, an area that is seeing even more fighting, not as much movement on a day-to-day basis, but definitely a lot of fighting and high casualties, is Toretsk. So we're going to begin with Dakhnia because we have geolocations from late March going into early April indicating that a large portion of Dakhnia has already been taken over by the Russian side. So let's look through these geolocations. First one is from April 11th. This is from the Predator Police Brigade. They hit a Russian tank north of Druzhba. Russian armor has recently become very active around here. There was a huge slump throughout, I suppose, the final 3 to 4 months of 2024 in regards to armored activity in Toretsk and to the west of it in the New York region. But now the Russians have been able to ration a lot of the resources around here and get a sufficient amounts to conduct on nearly the daily basis these armored assaults that do lead to large amounts of vehicular damage, even though a lot of the tanks or the MCLBs are protected with the turtle tank design. Nonetheless, they do get damaged a lot either by direct shelling or through FPV strikes targeting compromised areas. But based on that, we also have geolocations of where the Russians are present and how they've been able to expand their horizons. So you have this attack coming in from the east, north of Druzhba, and the Russian vehicles, they're advancing through open fields with the objective of reaching Dakhnia. And not the Dakhnia to the south. Dakhnia is a sort of spread out village. There are several dachas located in the northern part of Dakhnia that still remain under Ukrainian control, and the Russians are trying to reach those areas and take over the final vestiges of Ukrainian resistance that are basically situated across the perimeter of the city of Toretsk. So the Russians have had success in this regard. when it comes to an area that is a bit closer to the city. So you can see the Russians have captured over the past week or two nearly 2 square kilometers of territory. Let's look at some of the videos that back this up. So this is from April 12th, 28th Mechanized Brigade, one of the main units involved with defense over here and also around the Donbass Canal. They used FPV strikes and grenade drops to target Russian vehicles and infantry as they attacked from Krimske and entered into the houses of this rural village of Dakhnia. And then once they entered in, you have this video from April 12th of the 1004th Brigade of Security and Maintenance. So that's an interesting unit to actually have deployed to the front line. But now these forces are definitely needed given the depth of the Russian advance. So they hit Russian positions in Dakhnia with FPV drones, just targeting them in houses and in dugouts. And that gives us a good indicator that the Russians are present in nearly the entirety of the southern part of the village. And from there, they have the opportunity to expand their attack northwards and take over these forested regions and remaining dachas. Moving past that, there's the rail line, and the rail line is important because it can be used as a vector of advance. Located on a bit of higher elevation, there are windbreaks that are run parallel to it, so that's used for concealment. And so then naturally the next goal will also be the Alivka, which is just one of these areas that the Ukrainians have had under their control for so long, and as a result they've been able to fortify it, build up. And you can see that more generally, the region that is in between Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, it's actually really well fortified. And when it comes to the manpower, it's not at a high level, but the actual groundwork, the actual obstacles built in anticipation of an assault coming from the east to the west are really well built. But I don't know how much it will be able to resist an attack coming from the south, from where the Russians are in Toretsk right now, pushing up northwards. The defenses weren't really built for that purpose because they were built with this mindset. The Wagner group was still involved in the Battle of Bakhmut, and then you had the fighting in Chasiv Yar starting about a year ago, and that was sort of the backdrop amidst when all these trenches were built. So it's a bit different now, the situation on the ground. And you could also see that the Russians have continued expanding along this very narrow but extremely deep routes running along the highway that actually connects to Konstantinivka. Once you go up another, I don't know, let's measure it. Let's measure how far away the Russians are. So they're only 5.4 kilometers away at this point at their minimum extent, I suppose, from the city. You could see over here, April 11th, the Predator Police Brigade, very active unit around here. They hit a ZSTS Akhma infantry mobility vehicle. I don't know if this is attached to the first incident that occurred, the incident that has gone viral by now on April 20th of 2 Russian APCs getting destroyed, including one of them near Nelipivka. So I don't know whether this vehicle that got destroyed is a part of that same assault with the STSs or whether it's a separate one. But nonetheless, it indicates to us that the Russians have been able to expand their horizons even further and have been able to reach this important intersection. And this gives them access to a wide variety of roads spanning eastwards if they would want to go to the Delivka region, or northwards if they want to expand towards the eastern outskirts of Konstantinivka, or westwards if they want to reach the southern outskirts of the city. So this gives them a lot of opportunities. And now the question is whether they will be able to solidify control over here and build a solid base that will render all of the Ukrainian positions. And in terms of supposed surface area, they are really large. And you can see, I'm just going to go over them over here with the measuring stick. This entire region would be exposed. It would be flanked from the west, and thereby would be rendered superfluous, this entire 11 square kilometer piece of territory, if the Russians were to solidify control over the route they've been able to use to pave their advance deeper along the, I suppose, Kryvyi Terets River. So that's something to keep an eye out for. And likewise, we want to see whether the Ukrainians are able to muster reinforcements and push the Russians back and solidify the line over here. And they need to do it really quickly before the Russians sense that there is just a total Ukrainian deficiency over here and pour even more resources into this area. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And we know the Ukrainians have deployed some reinforcements because we have the 110th Mechanized Brigade deployed around here. We have the 2nd Battalion of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, which 93rd Brigade is split between the Chasiv Yar region, but then was moved to the Pokrovsk area, and now it's once again being split up to help defend, at least in parts, the Toretsk region, especially around Dakhnia. And then, of course, we have that 1004th Brigade, which I've just seen pop up recently. So that's something that's really interesting to keep in mind. Let's move on to the situation in Chasiv Yar. So over here we have the Russian advance just to the southeast of Supochki, minor gain amounting to 47 hectares. There's a geolocation here. I want to click on the map to show that to you guys. April 12th, the Phoenix unit of the 5th Assault Brigade, they conducted an FPV strike targeting Russian vehicles east of Supochki. First time in a while that we're actually seeing armored presence in Chasiv Yar, but this is a part of, once again, setting the groundwork, setting the framework up for taking over the southern environs of the city, areas that the Ukrainians have held on to for an extremely long period of time, despite forward bombardments and just positional shelling. And it's an area that isn't really well built for trenches, but it is rugged terrain, very difficult to overrun because of the dense forestry. But then to the west, you do have a lot of trenches that were built by the Ukrainians to protect the entrance into Konstantinivka. So something to definitely keep in mind. And I would also want to see how perhaps the area east of Supochki can connect with the current Russian vector that is east of Plashivka, whether there is some sort of plan. I suppose this would be something of a much larger extent and will require much more resources to penetrate that deep into the Ukrainian rear. But this entire region that you see over here, that I'm going to mark with this arrow over here, it is now inherently going to be exposed to attacks from its flank due to the Russian presence across all directions. So something to keep in mind. This is an area that's like 85 square kilometers in size and surface area. So that's really a massive region to lose, and would also mean that there's a huge buffer zone lost by the Ukrainians southeast of the city of Konstantinivka. So now to move on to the other part of Chasiv Yar where there was movement, the Ukrainians were able to reclaim this sliver of territory just south of the center of the city. So the 299th Regiment, which is a part of the 98th VDV Division, they conducted an FPV strike targeting a trench south of Chasiv Yar, as I said, April 11th. And that gives us an indication that the Ukrainians are present in an extra 15 hectares, slightly improving their position in this region. But I do want to move on to Kursk to end the video. Let's zoom in on the Kursk region because there is an interesting update from here based on Deep State's reporting. So they made adjustments to their map of the front line. And what we know as a result is that the Russian forces have been able to fully solidify control over regions west of Guevo. I was really early ahead of the curve when it came to reporting on Russian advances over here because there was a geolocation on Blue Sky actually showing that 7 Russian soldiers got caught in a minefield north of Gornal. And that served as an indication to me that by extension, all of the fields and forests north of the geolocation were no longer under Ukrainian control and were actually falling into Russian hands. And now we have that confirmation 3 days later with 7 square kilometers of territory being taken over by the Russian side, nearly reaching the border in several locations. And now, really, the Ukrainian positions that remain in Kursk have coalesced around Gornal and its environs, either to the east, where you have the Psel River, or the west, where you have some forested areas and a couple of ridges that span along the Sumy Kursk border. But the Russians are largely taking over these positions, clearing them out, and pushing back the 61st Brigade, 1 battalion of the Presidential Brigade, 129th TDF Brigade. The list goes on. And a word about Belgorod, we do now have a clear understanding of the order of battle. So you have the 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade, some of their elements, at least 1 or 2 battalions, operating near Popovka. Then you have the main unit involved with assaults towards Demidovka, being the 225th Assault Regiment. They have had attached to them units that are normally a part of the Air Force or a part of logistics and rear development, but they've been added in to help bolster the numbers for this assault, which is very interesting. And they're actually missing persons reports from soldiers that are supposed to be a part of the 299th Tactical Aviation Brigade, but for some reason they were a part of this assault into Belgorod, into Russian territory. And same thing for the 532nd Repair Restoration Regiment. They also had records of soldiers going missing because they were attached to this unit. At the same time, you also have the 47th Mechanized Brigade. They're operating around here, and the 33rd Assault Regiment. So that's just an update on the Belgorod region where we don't have much movement as of the past couple of days. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching. Thank you so much. Hopefully the Wi-Fi wasn't that bad, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.